Roosevelt was also concerned about Nazi propaganda that claimed that first Britain and France and ultimately the United States were fighting Germany on behalf of the Jews. He did not want World War II to be seen as a Jewish war. That was precisely what the Nazis were saying. The Treasury Department, presided over by Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, who was the only Jewish cabinet member, began to uncover facts that made them angry. The State Department was both trying to mishandle information about the Holocaust and block any kind of relief action which might be possible under the strictures of war. And so, in the end, Morgenthau took this critique to the president, and the president, in January of 1944, established a new government agency, basically taking jurisdiction away from the State Department. And that agency, called the War Refugee Board, helped to save approximately 200,000 people in the last year and a half of the war. So that's the big picture, the four Roosevelts. Now, that big picture is new. Nobody's written about Roosevelt that way before, but let me go into a little more detail about two of the most famous episodes to try to convince you we've got some new stuff in there. How many of you have heard of the SS St. Louis? Lots of hands. I have a question. How many passengers on the SS St. Louis were sent back to Germany? You know what the correct answer is? None of them. So let me tell you the story of the SS St. Louis. The story really began in November 1938. 2 days after the event known as the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, Franklin Roosevelt met in the White House with Colonel Fulgencio Batista, the strong man of Cuba, not yet the dictator, but more important than anybody else. Of course, Roosevelt being Roosevelt, we don't have a good record of that conversation. But Batista delayed his return to Cuba and went to New York and gave a speech in which he said that he would be pleased to cooperate with President Roosevelt in his effort to do something about the refugee problem in Europe. And from that point until middle of May 1939, November 1938 until May 1939, ship after ship left Germany with Jews seeking to get out while they could, and most of them had tourist visas sold for a substantial fee by Cuban diplomats, suitable for short-term stay in Cuba. But the understanding with the Cuban government was that, short-term could stretch on quite a while. And so people who could get to Cuba and were on the waiting list for American immigration visas could wait there safely. By May 1939, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 German and Austrian Jews were in Cuba, ship after ship. Then came the St. Louis. There was a backlash in Cuba. And maybe Batista was not spreading the fees around widely enough to the president of Cuba or the director of immigration. So the Cuban government changed its policies. The 22 passengers who had Cuban immigration visas were allowed to land in Havana. All of the others who had tourist visas were forced to stay on the ship. The ship began to sail around, not knowing what to do. The German captain of the ship was a very good guy and did not want to take those passengers back to Germany. The American Jewish organizations sent a negotiator to bargain with the Cuban government. He was confident that he could persuade them, if necessary, with a little money, to reverse their policy. He failed. The Coast Guard, the United States Coast Guard, began to track the ship, which by this time had become a big story in the press. The passengers on the ship, some of whom are still alive today, believed that the Coast Guard was trying to prevent them from landing in the United States. Of course, those who are still alive today were very young at the time, and this is probably what they were told, seeing Coast Guard ships. Let me explain. The Coast Guard had no reason to prevent them from landing in the United States because they could not stay in the United States. They had no visas. They had no immigration visas or temporary visas. They were trying to get into Cuba. There was no such thing as political asylum. If somebody had jumped off the ship and swam to Miami or Key West, there was no way to stay legally. The Coast Guard, whatever reason it started tracking the ship, the Coast Guard continued following the ship because Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, who was Jewish, called the Coast Guard commander and said, "We have negotiations underway. We want you to know where that ship is so we can direct the ship to the right place once we have some kind of settlement." And then Morgenthau said, "Please do not tell anybody that I am involved because this isn't really my business." We have the transcript of those phone conversations because Morgenthau's secretary used to transcribe his phone calls. So what happened? In the end, the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, a body established by Roosevelt's Foreign Policy Initiative with an assist from the State Department, persuaded the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Belgians to divide the passengers on the St. Louis. This was June 1939. There was no war. The Holocaust was at least 2 years away. You get an argument among the specialists when the Holocaust actually began, but at least 2 years away. None of the passengers went back to Germany, and none of the passengers went straight to the gas chambers, which did not yet exist. This is contrary to popular myth, which I'm afraid is nourished in part by a Hollywood movie, Voyage of the Damned, and it's also contrary to a lot of the early scholarship on the subject. In the end, something close to 1/3 of the passengers on the continent were caught by the Nazis and died. More than 2/3 of the passengers survived. And about half of the passengers, we have a name-by-name tally, ultimately immigrated to the United States. So, the revised story of the St. Louis.